would lead to their first life-changing adventure. Chapter 1. It was late June and school had just let out for the summer. The Splush brothers, Jim, John and Jeremy, were eager to explore the woods near their home. Last summer, they had found two abandoned tree forts, and if they could find one more, then each of them would have their own. Mill Creek was the kind of town where the trees outnumbered the houses. The Splush family house sat on a quiet cul-de-sac, backed by one of the green belts that cut through multiple neighborhoods. Along the green belt were wooded areas where the undergrowth was thick with sword fern and leafy debris. Tree trunks, fence posts, even the trampoline net in the backyard wore a permanent coat of green moss. Jim, at 14, was the oldest brother, with blonde hair, blue eyes, and good looks. He was sitting at his desk, looking out his window, remembering what happened on the last day of school. Two larger boys had been in the hall talking about his 12-year-old brother John, and how silly the name Sploosh was. John walked around the corner just as the two boys were talking, and they confronted him. Jim heard the boys loudly making fun of John. "Your dumb parents couldn't think of any names that started with letters other than J. And how about that last name, Sploosh? That's the sound your face is going to make when I smash it in the ground." As a final assault, they both spit their gum in his hair. Jim felt awful watching the boys pick on his brother. He wanted to defend John, but there was something inside that stopped him. A locker door slammed somewhere down the hall, and for half a second Jim's attention flickered toward the sound, instead of toward his brother, some small useless part of him, grateful for the distraction. Even though the boys were younger and smaller than Jim, he just stood there. John felt like all the courage had drained out of him at once, and he wanted to disappear, to be anywhere no one could see his embarrassment. As he started walking away, he saw his brother Jim. They locked eyes. Neither of them moved or said anything. Finally, Jim looked at the ground, turned around, and disappeared. Jim would replay this moment in his mind many times until he was emotionally exhausted. It bothered him that he didn't seem to have the courage he thought he should. In a few short months, he'd be a freshman, just another face in a school full of strangers. If he couldn't stand up for John here, then where would he? He didn't say any of this out loud. He wasn't sure he could have. The wind stirred the trees outside Jim's bedroom window and snapped him back into reality. He could hear his brother John in the next room, shooting Nerf bullets at the wall. John was built lean and wiry, all quick movements, with the same blonde hair and blue eyes as Jim, though he wore his hair a little longer and it was always messy. John's room was pretty typical. Nerf bullets already littered the floor from an earlier battle, half buried under comic books and a heap of unwashed laundry, and a poster of some superhero, long since ignored. The shooting stopped, and a few minutes later Jeremy, the youngest brother, knocked on John's bedroom door. Jeremy was small for 10, with the same blonde hair, and blue eyes running through the family, though his features were still soft and rounded with youth. Jim knew Jeremy loved his brother's Nerf guns, and he knew John wanted a moving target, so he fired the gun against the wall to grab Jeremy's attention. It wasn't hard to predict what would happen next. Jeremy knocked on John's door and waited to be invited in, but his excitement was strong, and he pushed the door open. The scene unfolded in slow motion. John had barricaded himself on the bed, surrounded by pillows. Jeremy was taking his first step into the room when John unleashed every bullet he owned from his Nerf Gatling gun. What followed was a chorus of irate screaming and riotous laughter. Suction-cup bullets hit Jeremy from nose to toes. Some whizzed past the door, and others stuck to the wall in the hallway. When the clip ran dry, Jeremy's feet had disappeared. They had been buried in a mound of bullets. Two of the bullets were suction-cupped to Jeremy's forehead, which made him look like a goat. John had released a ridiculous amount of ammunition. Jeremy let out a battle cry and ran toward John, but before he could gain any traction, his right foot slipped on a handful of bullets and he fell flat on his face. John started laughing hysterically. Their father stepped between the two boys. John had rolled off the bed, laughing so hard that his face turned red and his body seized in fits of laughter. Their father wasn't a fan of the chaos John had caused, but he admired how well the attack was executed. Jeremy dropped to his knees, grabbing handfuls of bullets and lobbing them toward John, who was now curled up like a pillbug. Jeremy was filled with rage, like a Viking swinging two giant axes as he leapt off a cliff onto his enemy, and his rage had taken over any reasonable thought he might have had. He wound up for one more throw, aimed square at John's curled-up body. But their father stepped in front of Jeremy Wright at that moment to break up the fight, walking directly into the path of Jeremy's swing. Before Jeremy could stop himself or even realize what was about to happen, his hand connected with his father just below the belt. Their father, a tall, muscular, stoic man, fell as though he were a robot that had just been unplugged. The hilarity of the situation sent John into another fit of laughter. His stomach muscles ached, and he clutched his chest with both hands. Their mother came down the hallway and peeked into the bedroom. She asked what had happened. John attempted to speak, but the only things that came out of his mouth were one-syllable words mixed with hissing and cackling sounds. Their mother bent down to help their father, but the searing pain from his groin had now moved up into his stomach, which made him nauseous. He managed to softly utter a few words. "Devils. We live with devils." Neither John nor Jeremy had ever seen their father crumple to the ground that way, hands between his legs, gasping for air. The hilarity of the situation sent John into another fit of laughter. John finally recovered his breath, and his self-preservation instincts kicked in. He knew there would be repercussions for this, but he also knew he could talk his way out of anything. In fact, John was so good at talking, and so likable as a person, that he often escaped punishment altogether. You might say he was sly as a fox. After their father recovered, he stood up and called both boys over to him. His first words were clear and simple. "What is going on?" Each of the boys gave their own account of the situation. Each of them got the worst punishment they could possibly bear. No game time for 2 weeks. By this time, Jim was still in his own room, piecing the whole thing together through the wall, the yelling, the laughing, the sudden silence, then his father's low, pained voice. Jeremy's muffled pleading for a lesser sentence carried down the hall clearly enough, but his father's answer stayed firm. From experience, John had learned that a reduced sentence would not happen today. He would wait for his father to be in a better mood, do some chores and something extra that made his father happy, and then suggest some kind of compromise for a lesser sentence. Jim had seen this play out many times, and he was always impressed at how well John could read people and use it to his advantage. 2 weeks without games was its own kind of quiet punishment for a house that had just been this loud, and by the next morning it had already pushed all 3 boys toward the one thing they still had. With John and Jeremy's game time gone, the woods were the obvious place to spend the day, and the trail felt like it was calling them, not an actual voice, just a pull, a restlessness to be outside. The boys stopped at the trailhead. Jim spoke up. "All right, so the goal is to find a third treehouse. We've already explored the first 2 of the 3 main trail systems. This time we're going to head left." The boys agreed, and John took the lead. They hadn't gone 100 feet before the trail simply stopped, swallowed up by a wall of undergrowth where the path should have kept going. Whoever had cut this trail in the first place had tried to find a way through, and eventually given up. "Well, that was a bust," John said. Jim pushed a few feet into the brush anyway, just to check. But it didn't open up, just more of the same dense tangle. They decided to head back home, look at some maps, and plan their next move. When the boys got back home, they put their bikes away in the garage and went inside to cool off. Later that evening, Jim was up in his room when something outside his window caught his eye. His window looked out over the greenbelt, and in the distance he could see the trailhead. Something over there was moving through the bushes very fast. It was faster than a rabbit or a coyote, both of which he'd seen in the woods many times, though coyotes rarely showed up during the day, and even then they kept their distance and vanished the second they were spotted. But this creature had a strange way of moving. It wasn't dodging branches or sticks. It moved like the grizzly bear he'd once seen on a nature documentary, ploughing straight through brush without a hint of hesitation. Jim watched as it crossed from a long row of bushes on the left of the trailhead to the bushes on the right, but it didn't jump across the trail in an arc, up and then down. It moved straight across like it couldn't be bothered by gravity. Its body seemed to glide rather than run. Then it kept barreling through the bushes on the far side of the trail. Whatever had just crossed the trail did not move normally. Jim decided he wouldn't tell John and Jeremy. Jeremy could get anxious in the woods, especially when he was by himself. Jim pinched himself just to make sure he was awake. His mind raced through every possibility. Some kind of escaped zoo animal, a new species nobody had ever documented even for one ridiculous second, something that wasn't an animal at all. But when he forced himself to slow down and think it through, the only things he actually knew were small and specific. He had seen the bushes moving. A blur had crossed the trail, and the blur was pinkish and brownish.